Hey, Missio family. Wish I could say it's good to see you, but I am stuck looking at these three guys, not the handsome faces of Scott Resniak or Rob Hammersma. But we decided to do another one of these because all 11 of you that watched last time were overwhelmed with how good this was. So who knows if this will become a regular feature, but want to do two things, break this into two parts. We're getting more complex with each one of these. So we're going to have initial conversation and then go back to answering some of the Ask Anything questions. But to kick us off, we want to kind of just address or revisit something that's critical to who God has called us to be and what He has called us to do at Missio. And at Missio, we have something we call the four values. They are God, truth, God, His truth, His love, and His mission. And out of those values flows some things, and we call those outcomes because they come out of valuing God, His truth, His love, His mission. And right now, we want to just simply, for a few moments, think about the idea of pursuing God or pursuing intimacy with God. For some of you, this may be old hat, but just toss it out there. What exactly are we talking about when we say the pursuit of God or pursuing intimacy with God as an outcome of valuing Him? Thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll go first. I tend to be the most outspoken, so I might as well.
There you go.
Absolutely. Can't get you to shut up.
Well, I'll be done. I'll say this and I'll be quiet the rest of the video, I promise.
Like a whole new personality on Zoom for you, Adam.
There you go. I'm doing my best. So I think we talk often about two primary things that God made us for, being relationship with Him, number one, and number two, representation of Him. And so when we think about the five outcomes of discipleship, we begin with the pursuit of God or pursuing intimacy with God, because it is His design for us. It's what He's called us to. It's what He desires for us. And it really is our greatest treasure, the most important aspect of who we are. And I think about, Paul's message where he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that as ambassadors, the message that he's imploring them to is be reconciled to God. That is right. The key outcome of the gospel is that humanity's greatest need, which is to be reconciled back to their Creator, back to their Father, has now been accomplished. And so the central thrust of his message is be reconciled to God. And that's the main thing that Christ accomplishes for us on the cross, is to now have access to the Father, relationship with Him, which sustains us, which satisfies us, and undergirds the rest of our entire being, our entire life, and all the other outcomes that we talk about.
Could you just list, for those that might not know, Adam, the other outcomes beyond pursuing intimacy with God?
I am ready, Bernie.
Whoa.
I didn't know you were going to ask that, but I am ready to show you this diagram.
Wow.
There you go.
Nice work.
There you go.
There you go.
Pursuit of God, fruit of the Spirit, grace story, spiritual giftedness, and stewardship of life. And perhaps in the future, we'll have opportunity to talk about more of those. Thanks for that wonderful graphic, Adam. That's beautiful.
I do my best.
So that's a quick summary of what pursuit of God is, pursuing an intimacy with God. But when we talk about these outcomes, what's the relationship to the values? In other words, how do the values and the outcomes relate to one another conceptually?
Well, in some way, Bern, you mentioned that in the beginning, that like out of a life that has these values at the center, the outcomes kind of flow. Like when we think of like the nature of who God is, right? that's the highest value that we have, right? And so I come into submission to that, right? As a follower of Jesus, I submit my life to that, and I submit myself to the authority of His Word, His truth, right? Um, and and so I walk in submission to that, and I've been loved by Him, and that love um, is continually transforming who I am, and so I live in submission to that, and and I've been redeemed. We've been redeemed by His redemptive work, this mission, and then He invites us into that. And so, as we've been, we're living lives in submission to who He is and to what He's declared and what He's done, what He's accomplished, what He's accomplishing. Out of that comes the fruit of discipleship, is what we believe, that there'll be followers who desire to continue to grow and continue to pursue the Lord, continue to grow in that intimate relationship through word and prayer. Learning those disciplines of spending time with the Lord, and learning to hear His voice through the Scriptures, and spending time in communing with Him in prayer, and then learning to commune with His people and whatnot, and then as we walk around that star, each of those other outcomes become outworkings of a life in submission to who God is and what God's done, what God's accomplished. That they're going to want to share their grace story, that they're going to be growing in the fruit of the Spirit, that they're going to understand their spiritual giftedness, that they're going to steward their lives wisely.
You mentioned growing in communion with the Lord and growing in communion with His people. I wonder what role does the congregational family of which we are a part, Missio, or any congregational family for that matter, what role does the congregational family play? How does it shape the outcome of pursuing God, pursuing intimacy with God? Thoughts on that? Is this a purely individualistic pursuit, or is it shaped in some way?
Yeah, we need one another to grow in our pursuit of the Lord. I mean, it's going back to what Jordan said. Like we, each and every one of us, we talk about phrases like in our exploring membership about people empowerment intensive, or the instrumentality of Christ people, like that. All of Christ's people, everyone who has the Spirit of God residing in them, is called to grow in the life of faith and the mission of the church. And so we, or grow in relationship with God, pursuit of God, and representation of Him. And the role of other believers, the word you use, the metaphor of family, like which is an appropriate metaphor. Like it's a metaphor that is particularly meaningful to me always, but especially now where we can't see our family that often right now face to face. Thankful for technology and virtual and all that. And we know the other metaphors. You've got citizenship, you've got body, we're a temple. But this picture of just having a faith family, and that family, like Hebrews 3:13 says, encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you are hardened by sin's deceitfulness. And so we need others to strengthen and encourage and build up and rebuke and correct and teach and train and love and provide and all of these things. But all of that is intended to help us grow in the life of faith or relationship, pursuit of God, and then as a byproduct, those other outcomes, representation of Him as we steward everything that the Lord has entrusted to us, as we bear the fruit of the Spirit, etc. And so, it's not an individualistic faith. It's not a faith where it's just me and Jesus and a Bible and a commentary. Like we need one another to do that. And we're seeing this in this pandemic, especially as all of our missional communities have gone virtual. Like the craving, yes, for relationship, but particularly Christian fellowship. But it's not just a bunch of Christians talking. Like, we're talking about the Lord and the things of the Lord in order to help us grow in our pursuit of Him and grow in our representation of Him. And so other believers, and particularly in our congregation of Missio, the folks of Missio are vital to that, and we need that.
Good. Any other thoughts on pursuit of God, pursuing intimacy with God?
Phrase that come to mind when you asked the last question about the congregation's role is just the repeated promise that God makes: I will be your God and you will be my people. You know, that's spoken when he's talking about getting them out of slavery, releasing them from captivity, rescuing us from our sins, restoring all things in Revelation 21. Like, when he moves and acts to save his people, it's always a corporate identity to bring you back as my people, right? To restore you, not just to myself, but together as a people to myself.
It's good. It's great. Oh, good. So want to circle back and pick up one of the questions that was asked in the Ask Anything portion. Let me just read this. This is sort of a lengthy question, but I want to get it out there, and I think there's a couple pieces to it. It says, the evangelical tradition can sometimes be criticized for over-spiritualizing the human condition. The notion that all that matters is what you believe in your heart and not what you do or say. I'm sympathetic to this critique, as I've seen this in action when fellow believers defend leaders, whether political or pastoral, who claim to be Christian but engage in unrepentant visible sin by saying things like, only God knows his heart, or who am I to say that so-and-so is a believer or not? Seems like the Sermon on the Mount paints a very different picture, with Jesus clearly saying that our actions matter and indeed are definitive in demonstrating that we are his people or not. At what point do we disavow a leader or professing brother as a wolf in sheep's clothing if they profess Christ but display no fruit? It seems dangerous, of course, because how much fruit is enough? What standard must I hold myself to if I'll criticize others? More concisely, what can we do to combat the view that Christianity is just a spiritual matter of the heart without turning it into legalism? I think it's a good question, and I think there's actually a couple different parts. And I'd love to address just a few of the parts. The questioner asks, who am I to say that so-and-so is a believer or not? Kind of, that's the thing the questioner hears. And they seem to think that the Sermon on the Mount paints a different picture. So this idea, can we look at a political leader, a pastoral leader, a celebrity, an actor, an athlete, and say, well, who am I to say that so-and-so is a believer or not? And I think where I take this question is, I think maybe the question at this point is off the mark because it misses what the fundamental nature of covenant membership in a faithful gospel confessing local congregation is all about. I mean, that's what covenant membership in a congregation is all about, the affirmation of an individual's profession of faith. In Matthew 16, Peter has that incredible profession of faith. And then Jesus basically says, yeah, Peter, on this rock, I'm going to build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So he's giving them authority to define right confession on this rock, the rock of Peter's confession and his leadership. He's giving them authority to determine what's a right confession and what's not. And then just 2 chapters later in chapter 18, Jesus says the same thing about the authority to bind and loose in terms of a person's unrepentant, visible sin. So what I'd like to say to the questioner is, I don't think we should be watching the TV, the news, reading journal articles, and thinking about an individual and they did this and that's intolerable and disgusting, and maybe rightly so. We should be thinking more in terms of professing brothers or sisters around us than a celebrity, an actor, a politician, a public figure. I don't want to overstate it, and maybe this is slightly overstated, but I often say, and these guys laugh when I say it, but I'm not interested if the quarterback for the Steelers is a Christian. I only care if he can throw the football around when he's on the field. Now, of course, I desire that all those men on the field and all the politicians everywhere, that they would come to know the greatness of the Creator and trust in Christ. Yes, but whether or not that quarterback for the Steelers, Ben Roethlisberger, is a Christian doesn't really affect me when I turn on the television to watch him sling the football around. It does affect his family. It does affect the people, his friends, his coworkers, his teammates, his neighbors. It does affect them. And so that's who it matters for. Now, that said, I make judgments all the time about statements and actions that I hear and that I see, and whether or not they accord with right doctrine. I think we have a right to evaluate, that isn't in keeping with sound doctrine. That's not in keeping with what the scriptures say. But at that point, I'm not evaluating the salvation of the one delivering it. I am simply defining whether the action or the action taken or the statement delivered is in keeping with sound doctrine. So who am I to say that so-and-so is a believer or not? In some regards, that's the right attitude to have. That's for that person's local congregation to affirm for them. And if they are, in fact, living in unrepentant, visible sin, then that congregation needs to deal with it. Again, that doesn't mean we can't disagree with their actions, condemn their actions, but I don't think that's for us to paint them in or out of the kingdom. And then the other part of the question, which I think was helpful, is what are we to do if they profess Christ but display no fruit? And again, I would just say, let's look locally. Let's think about brothers and sisters, men and women around us. With public figures, we know almost nothing of their life. What we see is such a small sliver that the media has chosen to highlight for whatever reason, good or bad. We have almost no knowledge of their actual lives. But I think to say that somebody professes Christ but displays no fruit maybe points to a misunderstanding of the Bible's teaching on justification by faith alone. It's a byproduct of maybe the second great awakening, that if you raised your hand in a revival service, if you walked a sawdust road, if you said a prayer, you were saved, and it didn't matter what your life was like. But James has something different to say on the nature of saving faith. Paul asks the question, how are we saved? He says, by faith alone. James asks, what kind of faith saves alone? And in chapter 2, he clearly says it's faith accompanied by works. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that kind of faith save him? And the answer is no. Saving faith is always accompanied at some point by an adornment of good works, adorning the gospel with good works. So to be honest, I cringe all the time when I see public figures profess Christ and then do something or say something that I deem incompatible with a life in keeping with sound doctrine. But I don't have to, nor do I think it helpful to make any ultimate decisions about their eternal security. I can evaluate the fitness of the different public postures they take, but not their membership in the kingdom or not. And so I think that's perhaps the way that I'd encourage the questioner to think about that, and really all of us. Any other thoughts on that? Did you pile on, guys?
You did a great job, Bernie.
Great smiles.
Good job, Bernie.
You all have great smiles. Not as good as Josh Beckler's, but pretty good. Pretty good.
A good smile.
Someday, maybe.
Great smile.
Well, Levi, you want to close this out? Final thoughts?
Appreciate the questions that people have thrown out there. As Bernie mentioned, we're not sure how many of these we'll do, but appreciate those who had wrote those. And if other questions come up, we are going to attempt to address some of those. At least that's the plan for now. And it's interesting, just in summary, like Bernie highlighting the importance of the family, of the local church, and what that means in terms of a public affirmation of one's profession of faith. And then when we were talking about pursuit of God, the importance of the local congregation, the family of the church, to help us mature and conform to the image of Christ. And so grateful for Missio Church. And of course, what I mean by that are just this family and the people. And, we look forward to being together again soon. So thanks for taking time to watch this or listen to it. And we pray that you're blessed. We'll talk to you soon.